Okay, so I'm going to be presenting joint work with Ben Fagenberg, who's at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So let me start off with some broad motivation. So it's long been understood that economic class or socioeconomic status may influence the nature of police-civilian interactions. And we have a great deal of evidence on this question in one particular respect. So there's a lot of evidence that low socioeconomic status neighborhoods tend to be policed more aggressively than more affluent neighborhoods. That's as measured by things like police stops, arrests, or just physical police presence. But it turns out we know much less about the following question. So if we look within a given context, how does the economic status of a civilian influence the nature of police-civilian interactions? So say take the neighborhood as fixed, how are people treated differently as correlated with their economic status? And this distinction matters. So one reason it matters is that under the high crime neighborhood doctrine, police basically have some leeway to use neighborhood contexts as a basis for suspecting someone of a criminal offense. And so there's a way in which police might operate differently depending on neighborhoods. So it matters within a fixed neighborhood, are people still sort of treated differently? So that's the question we're going to be interested in this project. Take the context as fixed, location, time of day, et cetera. Are low SES civilians policed more aggressively? And we think this is going to have potentially broad implications for a few things. So in particular, you might think interactions with the police might have implications for people's economic trajectory. So this question could have implications for economic mobility and inequality. It might also matter for general trust in criminal justice institutions, like how are people being policed? Is it fair in some sense? And more generally, this is a question about how police resources are being allocated and whether that allocation is efficient. So let me tell you about what we're going to do in this paper. We're going to be studying class disparities and discrimination, looking at traffic stops and searches subsequent to those stops using data from Texas Highway Patrol. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the exact address of a motorist to basically make as accurate prediction as possible of that person's income. So that's going to be one of our kind of novel contributions here. So we're going to have data on address, which allows us to come up with an income measure that often we don't see in other data. To make that inference, we're going to use a combination of ACS data as well as residential property value data. The first thing we're going to do is just present some descriptive statistics on basically, class-based disparities in search rates. So conditional on getting stopped for, say, speeding, how often are people searched for contraband? Contraband yield, meaning conditional on getting searched, how likely is it that that search is successful in the sense that it leads to some contraband discovery? And finally, we're going to look at class differences in exposure to what are called pretext stops. So what is a pretext stop? Some stops might be purely motivated by the infraction that, in this case, a state trooper has witnessed. So if you're speeding, you might be stopped purely because you're speeding. They want to stop people from speeding. There are other stops where part of the motivation is there's some infraction that was observed, but there's also this additional option value associated with the stop, which is that now I can investigate further to see if there's a more serious crime. So I might stop you not just because I saw your registration tag was expired. I might also stop you because of that. Plus, now I get to investigate and decide whether to do some further search. So pretext stop is one of these stops that's based on this potential option to search. So we're going to look at whether there are class differences in exposure to these pretext stops. Then what we're going to do is we're going to try and look at whether the class disparities we document, whether they're about discrimination per se. So whether police are looking at someone, making some inference about their economic status, and then making decisions about whether to stop or search them on that basis. The way we're going to try and make progress on that, which I'll talk about in more detail, is we're going to look at within motorist variation in perceived economic class. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take advantage of the fact that people are stopped often in different vehicles, conveying different class signals. And I'll talk more about that. Finally, in terms of mechanisms, we're going to look at the potential for class disparities in the court system actually contributing upstream to class disparities in policing. Okay, so let me just give you a broad overview for what we're going to find here. So first, I'll show you that class disparities in search rates are quite large. By contrast, so in particular, we'll find that people, low-income motorists are much more likely to be searched than high-income motorists. By contrast, if you actually look at how successful are these searches, it turns out searches of low-income motorists are much less likely to yield contraband. Okay, so those searches are less productive. We're also going to have some evidence that low-income motorists are more likely to be subject to these pretext stops. And the way we're going to provide evidence on this is we're going to write down a very simple model of police stop and search behavior. And a key prediction that's going to come out of this model is that, again, what is a pretext stop here? A pretext stop is one where I don't just care about the infraction I observe, I care about whether I potentially can search you after stopping you. If we think about,
could you tell us what are the pretext stops that you'll be looking at, or is that something you're going to tell us later?
yeah, so the way we're going to try and get at this is a bit indirect, and I'll talk more about it when we get there. But basically, the argument we're going to make is it's hard to know whether any given stop is a pretext stop. But through the lens of our model, one prediction is that troopers that are more search intensive, so troopers who just seem to conduct more searches of people in general, are more likely to have a motive to conduct pretext stops. So one way of kind of thinking through this argument is that if I look at, there's some set of troopers who actually basically search no one, they never conduct searches. If I'm a trooper that never conducts a search, there's a sense in which none of my stops could be pretextual. Because if I never conduct a search, why would I ever be motivated by the option of conducting a search when I stop someone in the first place? So by that same token, if I look at some troopers who are conducting a lot of searches, through the lens of the model, a higher share of that trooper's stops are going to be these pretextual stops. And so what I'm going to show you is that when low-income motorists are stopped, they're stopped by much more search-intensive troopers. And so through the lens of the model, that suggests they're exposed to more pretext stops. So it's a bit indirect, and I'll talk more about why we have to kind of do this, partly because you just can't identify whether a stop is a pretext stop directly. But that's the argument we're going to be making. Okay. Then I'll show you, so this is, I think, broadly you can call this descriptive evidence. Then we're going to be interested in, okay, to what extent are these class disparities driven by discrimination per se? It could just be that there are other reasons that troopers are deciding to search or stop someone that just happens to be correlated with economic class here, but it's not about class per se. To get at this, we're going to use this within motorist design, where again, the idea is take the same motorists. One day they're driving a relatively new, expensive car. Another day, maybe they have two cars in their household. They're driving their older vehicle. Those two cars convey different class signals to a trooper. And so we are potentially approximating an experiment here where we're varying basically the perceived class of a motorist. What we find is that using this kind of research design, motorists are much more likely to be searched when they're driving their low status vehicle, and they're much more likely to be stopped by a search intensive trooper. And so we're going to interpret that as evidence that at least in part, these class disparities we document are driven by discrimination per se. Finally, we're going to provide some suggestive evidence that perhaps part of what's going on here, why troopers are discriminating on the basis of class, is driven by downstream hassle costs associated with policing. Okay, so in particular, what we're thinking about here is we're going to cite evidence that, including work by Felipe, that one aspect of policing is when you arrest someone, you might have to show up in court to testify. And there's evidence to think that basically police don't like doing this. They prefer not to. They prefer to remain in the field. And so you can think of one cost of conducting a stop and perhaps a subsequent search here is that you might have to show up in court to testify and explain why you conducted that search. And you might be questioned about the legality of that search. And so it could be that these downstream hassle costs influence troopers' decisions over whether to stop or search someone. And this might have important implications by class here, because there's reason to think these hassle costs are going to be much lower when you're interacting with a low-income civilian. There's a couple of reasons to think that. One is that they're less likely to kind of put up a effective legal defense for a variety of reasons. And you can see this in the data, and to the extent that low-income motorists are much more likely subsequent to an arrest to plead guilty or plead no contest. So we're thinking of this as a proxy for basically how much hassle cost is associated with a given arrest. If I plead no guilty, if I plead guilty immediately, there's less kind of reason for a trooper to actually need to show up in court to kind of complete the case. So given this, it could be that what troopers are anticipating is that when they are interacting with someone they perceive as low income, that hassle cost is going to be much lower than when they're interacting with someone that's relatively high income. I'm gonna provide some additional supporting evidence for this mechanism, where what I'll show you is that if I look across jurisdictions, so here you should think about it as counties, troopers have much higher search rates in counties where, due to local institutional factors, hassle costs are, search rates are lower in jurisdictions where hassle costs are higher. Okay, and the way we're going to measure hassle costs, again, here is going to be just kind of overall guilty plea rates, overall no contest plea rates. Yeah.
Where does race, I'm sorry. Where does race fit in? Do they,
Yeah.
Are they able to, I mean, obviously race is correlated with class. But is there any evidence about whether troopers can, whether there's an independent effect of race?
Yes. So basically, so we have a prior paper that's looking at similar questions here but looking specifically at race. If you kind of decompose these disparities, what you would see is that basically the race and class effects are roughly multiplicatively separable, in the sense that if I look just among white motorists or just among Black motorists or Hispanic motorists, you would see this same kind of class gradient. In levels, that class gradient is going to be bigger for Black and Hispanic motorists in this context because they're getting searched overall more often. But in proportional terms, the relationships are actually pretty similar, conditional on motorist race. So we think both these kind of class and race disparities are evident, and you can think of them as roughly proportionally separable. Yeah.
How do you think they're using the vehicle type as a tagging? Like to tag if they think someone is more likely to be involved in crime?
Well, I mean, the way we're interpreting this is it's a tag of perceived income.
So one measure you can do is you have the criminal repository, like you have all
Yeah.
the arrests. So you can calculate for each vehicle type the arrest rate for non-traffic related stops. It's not traffic related offenses, sorry. So, and you can see like are people with certain vehicles more likely to be arrested for various crimes. So
I see. So look at, okay.
so
it wouldn't be like an arrest associated with that vehicle, you're saying,
you have
with that person?
Yeah, you have the person, you know all of the arrests.
Yeah,
you know
so-
the vehicle.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we haven't done that.
From my personal experience, I used to drive an old car. I got stopped all the time in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's
Search
exactly
by
our story, actually. So like when we kind of classify vehicles as high versus low status, the primary driver of that is just how old the car is. And people in old cars get searched much more often. It's actually like a phenomenon I wasn't even aware of until working on this paper and doing some, there's actually like a bunch of discussion of this on like Reddit and Quora, which I found reassuring, I guess. I was not aware of this as a general stereotype, but yes, that's exactly what we're finding. Yeah, I guess we could do something like this. So I mean, the way we're kind of classifying vehicles is we're saying, in our data, what's the predicted income for a person that drives this, for a person that's stopped in this vehicle? I think what you're suggesting is you could do the same exercise where you say, what's the criminal history or person driving this vehicle, and then ask basically which of those indices predicts
Yeah, I'm just curious if,
search behavior or
like you're
something.
saying that it's clear, like if there's lower likelihood of using contraband, that they're doing too many searches.
Yeah.
But could it be that they're still using as a tagging device, criminal activity, they're just doing it too much? Or they're doing it, or it's not a tagging at all? That was what I was curious about.
I'm not sure what you mean when you're saying tagging here, because they're,
You're saying that low-income voters are less likely to yield contraband.
yeah.
So is it that they're doing too many searches to low income, or should they not use vehicle type as a?
Oh, I see.
segment, or- That's my.
I think I would, based on what I'll show you, I think the answer to both of those questions is they're searching low income. If their objective is to maximize how much contraband they find, they're searching too many low income vehicles, too many low income people, and they're putting too much weight on the vehicle that they're driving. Yeah.
Does the sort of within motorist variation rely on like an assumption that people are driving the same way in their cars? Because I could imagine a scenario where like I've got a 95 Corolla and I drive like a maniac. I've got
Yeah.
a Maserati and I go like 10 miles under the speed limit everywhere. And like that, maybe is that
Yeah, it doesn't, so. Not exactly, it's not exactly a problem. So, for our research design. Yeah, because I think what could be going on there is the actual infraction associated with that stop could vary within person depending on the car you're driving. And in fact, well, we would see evidence of that. Now, whether that's about actual change differences in driving behavior versus differences in what police decide to pull you over for is hard for us to say. But I think even if it were the case that you were driving differently, I guess one question is, I guess that could change your interpretation somewhat. So on the one hand, you stopped the same person twice. Once you stopped them because they were driving fast, and another time you stopped them because their taillight was out. What we'll find is that, okay, you're more likely to get searched in that instance where you're stopped for the broken taillight. I should say, actually, to start off with, that everything I'll show you holds if we just look at speeding stops. So just people that are stopped for speeding, which addresses this to some degree. But for the more kind of general findings, I guess if people are getting, there's a question of to what extent like my search decision should depend on what I pulled you over for versus what I observed when I actually ticket you. Right. So if you think it should be mostly about the latter, then it doesn't really matter so much what you're getting pulled over for in the first place. The other thing I'll say is that even if you're driving differently in those two scenarios, it's less clear why the identity of the trooper that pulls you over is going to change in such a systematic way. It's less clear why the more search-intensive troopers should be more likely to pull you over for a broken taillight unless it's less clear why you see that association just based on, the fact that they're pulling you over for a different thing. Like different troopers are making different stops in a way that suggests they're profiling, basically. But yeah, I should probably just have delayed that discussion until when we get there, but maybe that said something, I know, yeah.
So maybe you want to delay as well.
Yeah.
It's related, but would it be also that it's just easier to pretext a stop for low status vehicle because it's more likely that they have something broken or something on which, so it's just, I search a lot of cars and it's harder to like stop a brand new car for a random reason.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So that's going to be more relevant when you're speaking about the pretext stop margin that, it could just be easier. You're just gonna have a larger set of things you can potentially stop them for if the car is old and is broken in some way. Yeah.
Let's try the top.
Sorry, I don't mean to be a cranky.
What?
We can let you get.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm happy with that. Question/comment. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how this work connects to the literature. So there's a broad literature on profiling or racial disparities in policing and criminal justice system more broadly, looking at various margins. So whether someone gets stopped, whether you get searched, whether you get a ticket or not, pretrial detention, sentencing, things like that. So we're contributing to this literature. And one way we're contributing is we're focusing on another type of social classification here. So now we're looking at economic status rather than race. We're also connecting to a smaller legal literature, thinking about anti-discrimination law and to what extent it applies to people based on class. So there's a question of whether there's some laws under which basically low-income people should be a protected class. And one argument for that is, well, potentially they should be if there's disparities, say in policing we document, that are not justified based on some sort of economic rationale. So we're going to have evidence kind of speaking directly to whether there is an economic rationale for the disparities in search that we find. We're connecting to another literature on the regressive burden of criminal justice policies. So largely this literature focuses on things like indigent offense, fees and fines, to what extent that has kind of disproportionate effects on low income versus high income people. And then finally, there's work looking at class discrimination in other contexts. This is largely outside of economics. This is more coming from psychology, sociology, where people have looked at, to what extent can people pick up or think they can pick up on cues and make inferences about people's socioeconomic status based on brief interactions. So things like, how are people dressed? How do they speak? And so, our work is connected to that to the extent that, police are making these same inferences when they're stopping people. But to the best of our knowledge, there hasn't been much work in this literature looking at policing in particular. Okay, so let me get into some institutional background and data to start off with. So as I said, we're going to be looking at traffic stops conducted by Texas Highway Patrol. So what you should have in mind here is these are stops for the most part that are conducted on state and interstate highways in Texas. So Highway Patrol has the whole state as jurisdiction, but most of their stops are happening in these locations. So what is a trooper doing in these stops? So they're stopping motorists if they observe or have a reasonable suspicion of some violation. That could be a moving violation, or it could be like speeding, or it could be some kind of regulatory violation, like this person has expired tags. During a stop, they can investigate if a motorist is carrying contraband. So here, the most common categories of contraband are going to be illicit drugs or weapons, during our period at least. They can conduct a search if they deem they have probable cause to believe some law has been broken. So for example, if they have some evidence that there's contraband present in the car. Even if they don't have probable cause, they can always ask for, and if they receive consent from the motorist, they can conduct a search in that instance as well. So about 80% of our searches and our data are either going to be these probable cause searches or consent searches. The other 20% are either searches that happen following an arrest or following an impounding of a vehicle. But mostly it's going to be these probable cause and consent searches. So let me tell you about the data that we'll have here. So we've got what should be in principle the universe of all traffic stops conducted by Texas Highway Patrol during the period 2009 to 2015. It's going to include so this includes both citations as well as stops that result in a written warning. Now I say in principle it covers all these stops because it's possible there's some stops that don't lead to any written warning. They're supposed to all lead to at least a written warning. There's not supposed to be any kind of informal off the books warnings, but it's possible that's kind of missing from our data. For each stop, we're going to have pretty detailed information on the context of the stop. So we're going to know the time and the location of the stop. We're going to have vehicle characteristics, which we'll get into later on. We'll have some basic demographic characteristics, and then we'll know the outcomes of the stop, including whether a search was conducted, whether contraband was found as part of that search. We'll also have trooper ID. Now, this is a common type of data set, a data set of traffic stops. What's unique about the data in Texas, though, is that it has information on the motorist's full name and address. That's going to be very useful for us in a couple of ways. So one way it's going to be useful is that it's going to allow us to match multiple traffic stops to the same person. So that allows us to do this within motorist research design, which I've talked about a little bit. The other thing it will allow us to do is it's going to allow us to come up with an income measure based on exact address. It's also going to allow us to merge in other data. So here we're going to be merging in individual criminal histories from the Texas computerized criminal history system. And that's going to allow us to, for any given stop, look at arrest and court outcomes associated with that stop. So we'll know whether you're stopped for contraband, you get arrested, whether that leads to a conviction or not, for example. We're also going to use some data on commercial address history data. And what that's going to be useful for in the background is if I see someone with the same name, but two different addresses in our stops data, we'd like to know, is that the same person or not? Maybe they moved. So we're going to use commercial address history data to figure out, basically disambiguate these cases where this person looks maybe the same, but they're in a different address. Is that the same person or not? We can use commercial data to try and make progress on that. Yeah.
Just on the bullet point above, where you link to the criminal histories, do you have previous arrests and convictions prior to the?
Yeah, we'll have that from the computerized, from this data set. We actually don't use that in this paper. We've used it in prior work, and we could use it for the kind of exercise that Tim's describing. But yeah, we're not using it here actually. Okay. So a big piece of this project is going to be trying to infer a motorist's income, which typically is not a variable you would have in traffic stop data. So what we're going to do is, to the extent we can, we're going to take someone's exact address and using whatever data we can come up with our best guess for what their income is based on their exact address. So in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to use a combination of American Community Survey data at the census block group level. That's going to give us information on the income distribution within a small neighborhood. And we're going to combine that with property assessment data. So here's the exercise we're doing here. Let's first think about single family, people that are living in single family homes. In the ACS, what we know is we know a couple of things. So among homeowners, everyone's divided, households are going to be divided into 7 income categories. For the full population, they're divided into 16 income categories. Let's think about the 7 income categories to begin with. What we're going to do is, okay, I know from your address which block group you're in, but I'd like to do better than just saying, assigning like the median income to a given household, because I know where they live within a block group. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's look at the property assessment for your value, for your home. And we're going to say, okay, if you have a home that has the Pth percentile property value within your block group, I'm going to assign you to the Pth percentile of the income distribution within your census block group. So the idea here, which is, it's not perfect, but the idea is, okay, if you're in a more expensive home within your neighborhood, we're going to assume you're richer than someone, you're higher income than someone who lives in a lower value home within your neighborhood. So that's not, obviously the correlation here is not 1, but there's definitely information that we're using here. For people that are not living in single family homes, we're going to assume they're renters, and we're just going to assign them the median household income for renters in that census block group. So in that relatively small neighborhood. Finally, so for the people in single family homes, we've got people assigned to 7 income categories. What we're going to do is we're going to assume that homeowners and renters, conditional on your coarse income category, basically follow the same distribution of our more granular income category. And so we're going to allocate people to these 16 income intervals accordingly. Okay. So all that is to summarize, we've got these 16 income categories and we're assigning people particularly people living in single family homes, to one of these 16 income categories based on the value of their home relative to their neighbors. Okay, I should say that, you know, we do all this, it turns out qualitatively and quantitatively, our results aren't going to depend much on how we decide to do this allocation. You could just assign people to their median block group income and we'd get the same results, but we're trying to do as well as we can here in terms of using the information available. One other point I'll make here is that, you know, we are mismeasuring income for reasons I've talked about. It's, for example, it's not the case that the correlation between income within a neighborhood and home value is one. But even so, you know, we're still arguably capturing some measure of economic well-being that's potentially broader than income, actually, if you just look at the value of someone's home. Yeah.
So I could imagine a police officer understanding based on your address, like the
Yeah.
general income of your neighborhood, but it seems less reasonable that they would know within this neighborhood, this home actually is
Yeah.
much nicer than this other home. So are you thinking of this as like this is something the police officer sees and directly discriminates on, or is this like a proxy for a bunch of stuff in the interaction that they might
Yeah.
pick up on?
That's a good question. So it's more the latter, and it's more for this part, really, all we're trying to do is we're trying to, as best we can, measure the income of the motorists, regardless of whether a trooper picks up on that. Because the first thing I just want to show you is, are high versus low income people experiencing different interactions with police, regardless of the source of that difference. So if we just had a data set that had the true income for each person and troopers had no idea, like we'd be happy with that for this point at the exercise. When we look at vehicles, then we'll start thinking more about what do troopers actually observe. And I agree with you that it obviously, like a trooper, unless, you know, they live in that neighborhood, there's no way they're obviously not doing this kind of inference just from looking at someone's ID. So that's not what we're trying to get at here. Yeah.
On the property assessment data, I
Yeah.
was trying to think about people who live in their house for a long time versus newcomers to the neighborhood.
Yes.
And there's a difference between a high value property and people who move in and out of a neighborhood. And I just want to make sure you're not picking up unstable neighborhood connections.
Can you say more about why we would be capturing unstable connections?
Well, newer, I guess it would go the other way, right? So people who move in more recently, their properties assessed more recently.
Oh, I see. No,
Yeah.
these are supposed to be annual assessments. So it's not an assessment based on like when you bought the house.
So in Texas, they do it annually.
Now, people have written papers about the extent to which those assessments are fair.
Mhm.
So I would certainly don't want to say, I want to emphasize that we're doing the best we can with the data we have. There's certainly some reasons to think it's not going to be exactly right. But these assessments are in.
Is this a commercial assessment agency or a part of the Texas?
That's a good question. So the data are commercial, but I believe the assessments are just coming from the state, from the county assessment office.
So Judy may be right about variability in how the county assessment office is doing it.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, again, it's probably not, it's not perfect, but it isn't subject to this. These assessments are supposed to be annual. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Okay. So this is just to show you what we end up with from this exercise. This is the income distribution of stops where we divided households into these 16 categories. So you can also get a glimpse of, this is household income, what these categories are that we're going to be working with. Okay, so let me show you some descriptive, what time do we go to? So let me start off with this descriptive stuff. We're going to look and see how do search rates and then hit rates vary with motorist income. So first we'll look at search rates. So what I've done is I've taken these 16 categories of motorists by household income, and then I'm just plotting what's the search rate for each bucket of people. So overall, about 2% of stops lead to a search. And what you're seeing here is there's a clear and negative relationship between the income of the motorists and search rates. The slope, this beta coefficient I'm reporting here, that's just coming from a bivariate regression of search rate on log household income. Okay, so this is indicating a 10% increase in income associated with a 0.05 percentage point decrease in search rates. Yeah.
So if you were to do the same by the value of the car, would you
Yeah.
get something very similar or not? So I'm just wondering.
We'll come back to that.
Okay, okay.
We'll come back to that. It'll be much stronger in magnitude. So, yeah, much bigger coefficient, but qualitatively simple. And we'll talk about why when we get there.
How does the distribution of stops by income that you had in the prior slide compare to just the distribution of income for drivers and residents?
We haven't tried to do that kind of benchmarking. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, so one way of describing this relationship is if I look at people in the bottom quintile, bottom 20% by income, they're searched in about 2.5% of stops versus motorists in the top quintile are searched in about 1% of stops. So if you're in the bottom quintile, you're about 2.5 times more likely to be searched relative to people in the top quintile. In previous work, as I've mentioned, we've looked at racial disparities in the same outcome. So as a point of comparison, Black and Hispanic motorists in this context are about 150% and 60% more likely to be searched than white motorists. So in that sense, actually, these class disparities are similar in magnitude to racial disparities that have been the focus of this literature. Now, one thing, that's just the raw data. And the way I set this up, I said, well, part of what we're doing is we're looking within the same context. So one thing we're going to do here is we're going to ask, okay, to what extent does this relationship hold if we look within context, where context here is going to mean looking at the location of the stop, the time of the stop. We're also interested in whether controlling for other motorist demographics affects this relationship as well. So how much of this is just picking up, for example, racial differences in search rates. So to do that, we're going to estimate some simple regression models like this, where basically we're regressing, in this case, an indicator for search on our income measure, but then also fixed effects for the trooper patrol area, which is going to be our measure of geography. And you should think of as like a county or sometimes a section of a county for more populous counties. Time of the week, where that's going to be the quarter of the day, and whether it's a weekday or weekend, and then the year. If we try more granular measures, we'd find exactly the same kind of relationship. And then our motorist demographics we're going to look at are race and gender. Another thing we'll do is throughout, we're going to look at to see how things change if we just fixate on speeding stops, because you might worry that, as I mentioned, part of what's going on here is people that are high versus low income motorists are getting stopped for different infractions. So maybe there's a sense in which it's not about the motorist. The pattern is not about the motorist, it's about the infraction they're stopped for. Now, as I'll talk about later on, arguably the infraction that you're stopped for is endogenous to income or a function of income. So it's not clear you should be conditioning on what you're stopped for. But nonetheless, I think it is reassuring that basically everything I'll show you would hold if we just looked at speeding stops. Turns out overall search rates are lower in those stops, but proportional differences in search are actually even larger. Okay, let me show you briefly what things look like when we try conditioning on stop context. So the first column here is just the bivariate slope that I showed you on the figure before. Second column, conditions on the location of the stop and the time of the stop. Things don't change at all. Things attenuate slightly if we condition on motorist race and gender, and that's mostly just capturing the fact that Black and Hispanic motorists are both more likely to be searched, and on average, you're going to have lower income in these data. Okay, but the relationship is, for the most part, holding within racial groups. Okay, so that's search rates. Now, a natural question is, to what extent are these searches more or less successful as a function of motorist income? One logical explanation for why troopers are searching low-income motorists more often is, well, maybe they're more likely to carry contraband, and that's all police are trying to do is find contraband. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure what are called hit rates, and that's conditional on getting searched. How likely is that search to yield contraband? Now, this is kind of a simplistic measure of how successful a search is. It turns out it's gonna be sufficient for our purposes because the types of contraband people are found with. And although we haven't actually, I don't have this in the slides today, but what we found previously is that, say, the amount of contraband you're found with or how severe the finding is does not really, it's not really associated with income. So high and low income people, if they're searched and found with contraband, the types of things they're found with are actually not that different. Okay, so here's how things look with hit rates. So remember, search rates decreasing in income, hit rates dramatically increasing in income. And so here, what does this coefficient mean? This is saying if I increase your income by 10%, conditional on getting searched, you're about 0.3 percentage points more likely to be found with contraband. Okay, so this turns out to be a little bit more sensitive to controlling for context. So this relationship actually halves if we look within a given sergeant area by year combination. Doesn't really have much to do with motorist demographics. So this is, I think pretty striking. And on its face, what it suggests is it's sort of hard to rationalize the differences in search rates by income based on a story where troopers are purely trying to maximize how much contraband they find. Now, we're going to argue that this pattern suggests that actually troopers could, if they wanted to, reallocate searches from high-income motorists to low-income motorists, and actually reallocate from low-income motorists to high-income motorists and actually increase overall contraband yield. Now, it turns out actually whether that argument holds depends on some kind of technicalities in terms of whether the hit rates of searches at the margin differ from hit rates for the average search. We've shown in other work that actually in this context, that distinction doesn't seem to matter very much. But we'll come back to this notion of what do things look like for the marginal search in a bit.
One,
Yeah,
you're not controlling for the cell type, right?
no.
And do you want us to think of this as capturing the cell type and not capturing?
I don't think I want you to be thinking about the car type yet.
Then why should? Oh,
Because here I'm just asking a question, are low-income people treated differently, basically, and not making any sort of claim about what the source is. So whether it's about the car they're driving or not is not really, I'm just trying to establish some like novel descriptive facts without trying to say anything about the mechanism yet. Yeah.
Small comment. I think for both graphs, it seemed like it was flat at the bottom.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, I don't know if the log's the right, I don't know if it's the figure.
Yeah.
Already log or something, but it seems like you're underestimating the slope and goes.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, we've got like a log scale here already.
Right, so
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's part of the reason we do, like, when we report it in the paper, the headline numbers we report are just comparing top quintile to bottom quintile
I see.
for that reason, but yeah. Yeah.
Just back to the search rates. So how do you actually measure the discrimination or bias in search rates if we don't have the data on the motorists that the police observe but don't stop?
Yes, so to this point, when I look at search rates, what's nice about looking at the search margin is we can just say, okay, we can look at all the possible searches that could have happened, and that's just going to be take all the stops that occur. So
The stops themselves, it's baked in, right?
yes. So yeah, at this point, all we're just saying is among the people, if you're stopped, which could be subject to its own profiling, and we'll show some evidence on that in a second. But just take that as given for now. Conditional on being stopped, you're more likely to get searched if you're low income. So we're punting on this point of like who gets stopped versus not. I'll come back. That turns out to be harder, but we'll come back to that next. Okay, so hit rates increasing in income, search rates decreasing in income. That's where we're at so far. So let me talk a little bit about this pretext stop question. So this question was the perfect segue for that, actually. So As I talked about, some stops are pretextual. So they're based on some minor infraction with the goal of identifying a more serious crime via search. Given that low-income motorists are more likely to be searched, it seems plausible that low-income motorists are also going to be targeted for these pretext stops. Okay. It turns out, though, that this is it's hard to answer, it's hard to estimate the extent to which this is true. Because we don't have data on all the stops that could have happened but didn't. Right. So in this literature, this is known as the benchmarking problem. When we're looking at searches, we can just take our denominator as all the stops that are happening because we have data on those. But if you want to look at the step before that, who gets stopped, you're in a much tougher position because we don't have data on all the stops that could have happened but don't. So then it's hard to know who's getting kind of stopped more often than they should be. So that's a problem, and we're going to try and make progress on this by basically circumventing this benchmarking problem. And part of how we can do this is we're not looking at whether there are disparities in whether you're stopped per se. We're looking at disparities in whether your stops are pretextual versus non-pretextual. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through our kind of model in detail, but here's the basic reasoning for how we're going to try and make progress on this. So we've got in the background this model of trooper stop and search behavior. So the idea is, what we're doing here is we're kind of taking an off-the-shelf standard economic model of trooper search behavior, where that has typically focused on a trooper's decision to search somewhere or not. So troopers see some signal from a motorist, they decide, okay, is that signal strong enough for me to want to conduct a search and try and find contraband? We take that model and extend it one step further and say, okay, the trooper's also making a decision about whether to stop someone in the first place, just based on, whatever infraction they've observed. When they decide to stop someone, they could just base it on the infraction they observe. So it could just be, this person's driving so fast, I need to stop them. But they could also have a motive where part of the reason they're stopping someone is now there's this option value of conducting a search following the stop. So I might stop someone for minor broken taillight or something, but I stop them not just because of the broken taillight, I stop them because I want to investigate further. Maybe this person has committed some more serious crime. So in that model, what we're defining as a pretextual stop is any stop that only happens because of this potential search motive, right? The infraction itself is not serious enough to warrant the stop. So one prediction that comes out of that model is that if I take two different troopers, one trooper who basically just likes to do more searches versus a trooper that doesn't like to do searches, a trooper that likes to do more searches is going to have a much stronger pretextual motive to conduct stops. And as I said at the beginning, an extreme version of this argument is consider a trooper who never conducts searches. If I'm someone who never conducts searches, there's a sense in which none of my stops could be pretextual because I'm never motivated by the idea of conducting a search. That's just not something I do. But more generally, what this argument suggests is that search-intensive troopers conduct more pretextual stops. And so if I find that one group of people is stopped by more search-intensive troopers, that's evidence that they're exposed to more pretextual stops than another. Okay. If you have questions about that reasoning, please ask. But otherwise, I'll just talk through what we do. So we're going to measure trooper search intensity. That's the kind of key prediction we're looking at here. And when I talk about search propensity, I really want to be taking everything else about the stop as fixed. I want to put two troopers in the same exact situation. They're stopping the same person. I want to ask whether one trooper is more likely to conduct a search than another. Say because they just find conducting searches less costly than another trooper, or they enjoy conducting searches or something like that. So we're going to try and construct these trooper search propensities in a variety of ways. One is just take the trooper's overall search rate and what percentage of stops do they conduct searches. But then we're going to try and control for the context of the stop in richer and richer ways. So another measure we'll look at is, well, let's first partial out motorist income and the context of the stop, and then we'll get a residual measure of a trooper's search propensity. Or we can do something even finer, and we can actually partial out both motorist and location by time fixed effects. So here we're thinking of, you take the two troopers stopping the same motorist and ask whether one trooper is more likely to search that motorist than another. So for each of these measures, we'll construct a standardized measure. We'll standardize these measures to be mean 0 and standard deviation 1. Okay, here in this figure, I'm just showing you our most simple measure of trooper search propensity, number 1 here. Things will look qualitatively similar for the other ones. And I'm showing you the same kind of plot I've shown you before. What this is showing you is that when you're stopped, high-income motorists are stopped by troopers that have lower search propensities. And the way we're interpreting that is when they're stopped, these stops are less likely to be pretextual stops if you're high income. Now note the magnitude here is quite low, or it's quite small. So what this is saying is a 10% increase in income is associated with a 0.002 standard deviation decrease in your trooper search propensity. So it's statistically significant, but economically much less so. But I'm going to show you when we look at what we think is a more salient measure of a motorist's economic class here, in this case, the car they're driving, you'll see the relationship is much stronger. We'll talk about why we think that is when we get there. Okay, so that's the descriptive facts we've got so far. And we've got regression versions of this as well. It turns out the relationship is even weaker if you look at our kind of richest measure of trooper search propensities, where we've got motorist fixed effects, but qualitatively things are not changing that much depending on what we control for. Okay. So let's talk about whether what we're documenting is driven by discrimination or not. So we've got this kind of classic problem here where we've documented some disparity between groups. Low-income motorists much more likely to get searched. It could be that they're being discriminated against on the basis of perceived income and perceived class. Or it could just be that class is correlated with other things that troopers are looking for when they're deciding whether to conduct a search. And so they're not actually discriminating on the basis of class. It's just some disparity that's driven by some other process. Now, we can argue about to what extent it matters, whether it's discrimination about class per se, or something that from the perspective of the motorist has maybe the same exact outcome. But we're going to pursue this question nonetheless. And this is a central challenge in this literature, distinguishing between these two types of stories. Ideally, or one version of an ideal experiment here is you randomly vary the perceived class of someone, holding everything else about behavior fixed, and then ask, how is that person treated differently depending on this random signal of perceived class? You can kind of think of this as like what's done in an audit study, right? We hold the resume fixed beyond some signal of a person's group identity. We're basically going to try and approximate an audit study, but in this arguably less kind of artificial context here, right? We're looking at actual organic interactions. So our strategy is going to be take the same person who, we're going to argue is basically fixed in a variety of dimensions over time, or at least varying in ways that are not problematic. And we're going to vary what class signal they're sending to troopers. And in particular, the class signal we're going to focus on is what car they're driving. Okay. Take someone, same person, stopped in one car versus another car. What we're going to assume is that, other than the perceived class that's coming from the car they're driving, other characteristics of the motorists, their behavior as relevant to, whether troopers are going to infer they have contraband or not, is uncorrelated with changes in the car. That's going to be an assumption we're making. If that's true, then what we've got here is something that basically approximates an audit study. The signal is varying, but other things are held fixed. Yeah.
How much? So in some sense, this is like, maybe this is not a fair question, but you can still be, the trooper doesn't know that this is the same guy in the test, right? So like,
Yeah.
So it's not that, I'm not so sure how it deals with the second question. So I'm just curious, like, can you tell me anything institutionally about what
What's
the
this?
trooper knows when they stop someone, like, do they run the plates and they know the criminal history of the guy? Or like, is there something that they know about that person that's the same in both scenarios and just the signal of class is varying?
Okay, so yes, they could run the plates and look up the person's criminal history.
Yeah,
I think the argument we're making is when you stop someone, you see the car, you interact with them, maybe you run their plates, maybe you make some inferences based on how nervous they seem or their appearance or whatever. The idea is you could have looked up their plates regardless of what car they're driving. So there's not any really change in your access to that information. What we want to argue is that all that's relevant that's changed is what car the person is driving. Now, whether you know, from our perspective, it's fine that the trooper doesn't know that yesterday you were driving your nicer car. All that matters is that we can see the same person stopped under different, in context where they're sending different class signals. Like that's what we're trying to exploit here.
for sure.
Not
I
sure.
just was thinking about like, what is it that they're potentially caring about that's correlated with perceived class?
Oh, I
Do
see,
they
yes.
know- do they know about that in the same way for both interactions? Or are they still guessing like this car has a higher criminal history?
Oh, I see. Yeah, so this is kind of going to Yotam's question. I think, yes, so we don't know exactly what troopers are inferring from the car.
Yeah,
What we're gonna do is we're gonna say, we're gonna construct our best prediction for someone's income based on the car. And then we're gonna show that measure has a ton of predictive power for what troopers do. It's not quite as, it's more complicated than that in the sense that, well, cars maybe convey other things, or at least troopers perceive they convey other things. In our context, car conditional on income is going to be correlated with education. Our car measure is going to be correlated with education. It probably, at least among low income motorists, is going to correlate with their liquidity. Those are all kind of broadly measures of economic status, but it's possible that troopers see a nice car and they're not thinking about someone's income, they're thinking about something else that is that they perceive as correlated with the car. And so it looks like class-based discrimination, but actually the trooper's not doing that sort of calculus in their mind. I think that's fair. I will say, well, actually, we did do something kind of related to this that I forgot to mention, which is that if you look at every combination of car characteristics, you basically classify cars based on make, model, or make, year, and car type. Our measure is going to be, what's your predicted income based on that car type? But you could also, one exercise we did is we asked, okay, how much does our measure capture variation in search rates across car types? Right, so is it the case that there are some cars, maybe there's just some cars that get searched all the time, and it's not about the income associated with the car, there's just something about that car characteristic? I think what we found is that basically our income measure captures something like 70% of the variation in search rates across car combinations, which doesn't speak exactly to what you were bringing up, but I think that does say that when we're looking at how search rates vary across cars, our income measure does seem to capture the bulk of that variation. So we think that's like, whatever troopers are inferring from that, we're not sure. That measure does seem to characterize cars pretty well in our context. Yeah.
My question, I love this experiment that conceptually it's great, but and I'm worried a little bit about, so why are people living in vehicles and are they really the same person? Or like in the sense of like, okay, if I get a new job, my income's higher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very close in time.
Yeah.
Or identifying people who are like you said, your idea would be I have two cars and
Yeah.
okay, I have one and the other one. And that would be ideal as compared to like, no, I change job or something else. And then it's not so clear.
Yeah, we're gonna worry about exactly this. So we'll look at cases where, okay, short time period between stops. We'll also look at instances where someone stopped in car A, then car B, then car A again. where we're thinking, okay, you must have access to both cars and basically things will look the same. Yeah. Okay, so that's the idea. Yeah,
I'm worried about your assumption.
Yeah.
That, that the variation of the motorist characteristics is uncorrelated with the variation in.
Yeah.
That strikes me as fundamentally implausible. And the reason it does is that while there may be variability between, people may have cars of different, that aren't all 2024 SUVs or whatever. Probably the characteristics of cars are correlated with the characteristics of individuals, so that the two cars that people drive who have high income are better than the two cars that people drive who have low income.
No, so this is different. This is saying, suppose you have access to a 2024 Lexus and a 2005 Civic or something. Some days you drive the Lexus, some days you drive the Civic. We're saying, okay, maybe one day you're feeling in a better mood than the other, or whatever, but that should be uncorrelated with the car you happen to be driving that day. So it's taking the same person as given as fixed and asking, on days you drive one car, are you a different person from the days you drive another car? And we're saying, maybe you are, that's the argument. It's not.
The claim is that the person characteristics are fixed.
Yeah, it could be that your personal characteristics are varying from day to day because, you got good rest the night before or something, but like, that's not correlated with the car you're driving. So the within person variation in your characteristics, within person variation in like aspects of you that troopers would use to predict whether you have contraband, that's not systematically correlated with what car you happen to be driving that day. That's the argument.
Okay.
And I'll show you some evidence, I think, consistent with this, but just on the plausibility of this, what we have in mind here is there's quite a bit of people with access to multiple vehicles. And also car purchases are infrequent enough that, if you hold on to a car for like 10 years and the next day you buy a new car, that's actually a pretty big jump in the perceived class a trooper would have based on the car you're driving, but that would be totally normal car buying behavior. It's not like we, are leasing cars on a daily basis that signals like how much income do I have today. This is also quite common in the sense that the context we're studying is quite common in the sense that a lot of motorists, 60% of stops involve motorists that are stopped multiple times in our data. And that's just in this 6-year window. And in pairs of consecutive stops, over half involve different vehicles. So this is not an unusual population of people to be studying. Okay, so I've mentioned the income measure we're looking at. This is just taking the make, the type, and the age of the car, predicting income, household income based on that measure. What I'm showing you here is the distribution of our vehicle status measure for people in the bottom 20% by income versus top 20% by income. So there's a couple of things to note here. There's quite a bit of variability within income groups. There's also quite a bit of overlap. So that's picking up the fact that actually the correlation between these two income measures is only 0.25. So there's signal there, but there's still quite a bit of variability. I think that's all I need to say here. So one thing that I've alluded to is if you constructed the same figures that I showed you before, where instead of putting household income on the horizontal axis, you put vehicle status, what you would find is that for search rates, the magnitude jumps up significantly, right? The coefficient on vehicle status is an order of magnitude larger. And they're supposed to be measured on the same index, which is income or predicted income. Now, one way to interpret this is just that vehicle status is much more salient to troopers than your actual income, which would be much more subtle to convey. But it's also the case that vehicle status is correlated with other things conditional on income. It's probably more about the salience, but we're not really trying to make a strong argument there. When I look at actual, your likelihood of having contraband, actually your vehicle status and your household income have kind of similar predictive power. If I put them both in a regression. And again, for the trooper search propensities, this is much more about the car you're driving than your actual income. Yeah.
I'm going to put this exercise in context where household income is much more salient without the cars. I see
Yeah.
that your address is maybe non-white because you put the other people have shown.
Yeah.
So then maybe all of this would take over the vehicle type. And if
It's-
not, maybe it's something specific about the vehicle.
Yeah, it's a great idea. The problem is in our context, because they're highway patrol, it's not really, you know, there's not really a sense in which you're stopped in a neighborhood. You're just stopped on the highway. And
But they have
so
your address.
they have your address. So I mean, I think what you could potentially look at is if the trooper is like based in that area, they might have more context as to whether your address conveys that you're high or low status. So it's something we haven't looked at, but I think it's a little less clear how that would work versus if you were just looking at a municipal police department where they would know, oh, you're stopped in this neighborhood. Yeah. Yeah, actually, we'll talk more about that. I'm interested how you would combine those two. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take consecutive pairs of stops for the same motorists. We're gonna measure first differences in outcomes. So in this case, it's gonna be whether you're searched or not. And we're gonna regress that on basically first differences in your vehicle status. Okay, so for a given person in consecutive stops, there's actually quite a bit of variation in there's quite, the changes within a given person of vehicle status is pretty large. So the average absolute change in vehicle status is about 19 log points when I look at consecutive stops of the same person. So here's how things look when I do that within driver exercise. So what this horizontal axis is looking at is how much did your vehicle status change from stop 2 relative to stop 1. So 0.25 here means I'm stopped in a 25 log point nicer car in my second stop. And what this is showing is that if I'm stopped in a nicer car, I'm less likely to be searched. And vice versa, if I'm stopped in a worse car, I'm less or lower status car, I'm more likely to be searched compared to my previous stop. So this is just showing within motorists a strong relationship between car status and whether you're searched. This within motorists relationship is about 25% of the kind of overall relationship that we're showing here. We think of this as a lower bound on how much discrimination per se explains the cross-sectional relationship, because there's other class signals that are held fixed within a motorist that's getting netted out in this research design. Now, let me just talk briefly about the credibility of this research design. So one thing we can do is we can ask, are people that are moving on to nicer cars, are they already sort of on a trajectory where their outcomes are potentially going to change over time regardless of what car they're driving? So what we can do is we can look at someone who stopped twice in car A and then stopped in car B. And I can ask, between those two stops of car A the first time and the second time, do I see changes in your search rates that are predicted by whether car B is nicer than car A or not as nice as car A, right? So this is basically looking for pre-trends. What this is showing is that there's no real evidence of pre-trends as measured in that way. That there's no kind of change, there's no predictive power about future changes in vehicle status. I mentioned the other kind of robustness checks we do. We can look at instances where there's very little time between stops and things look very similar. Can also look at instances where I'm switching from car A to car B to car A. And as would be consistent with our research design being valid here, what you would see is that, even in instances like that, those two stops of car A, there's not much change. Basically, whether I'm searched in those two stops of car A doesn't really depend on what car B looks like in between. And at least based on our address-based income measure, it's not as though people, when they're getting nicer cars, are also moving to nicer homes. Yeah.
Oh, weird. From the separately from gender. I guess I'm thinking.
No, I don't, not that I remember.
Seems to care more about their cars.
Yeah.
My prediction would be that targeting these patterns would be stronger among men than women. That
Yeah.
for the
Interesting.
reason, but I don't know if this is
Yeah.
true.
I haven't done that. What I do know is that in these data, women are searched less often, but actually gender does not, conditional on being searched, it's not as though searches of women are, I think the hit rates are actually similar for men and women. That's the extent of what I remember about gender related results in this context, but I don't know how that interacts with the car stuff. Okay, let me just wrap up here more or less. So one last thing I'll show you in this space is if we look at this pretext stop margin as well. So what's the search intensity of the trooper that's stopping you? This also holds sort of within motorists. Where here about 80% of the cross-sectional relationship between car status and trooper search propensity holds within motorists. I'll skip this and I'll just say on the last point here. So, we're interested in what explains this discrimination that we're identifying. Why are troopers apparently targeting low-income motorists? And one story we have, could tell just a kind of standard discrimination story. But I think one story that could make sense here is that troopers are considering what are the downstream hassle costs associated with a stop. If I arrest someone, there's additional work involved following that arrest. I might have to show up in court and testify, and I might not like doing that. So there's other work suggesting reasons why troopers may not like doing this. Other work showing that actually officer failure to appear in court rates are pretty high for these kinds of stops, perhaps for exactly that reason. And so it could be that what troopers are doing is they're inferring, okay, this is the kind of person where if I arrest them, it's actually not going to involve that much downstream work for me because they're less likely to put up a successful defense. We know, there's reasons to believe that would be true, but we want to see whether that story kind of plays out here. So I want to show you a couple of figures consistent with that idea. This is looking among people that get arrested after they're found with contraband in the car. How often are they pleading guilty or no contest? Which is, we can think of a rough proxy as how much of a legal fight you're putting up. We don't have direct measures here of whether a trooper had to show up in court, but there's reason to think this is going to be highly correlated with whether troopers had to show up in court as part of this case. What you see is that low-income motorists are much more likely to plead no contest or guilty. This is in our sample of arrests associated with searches. You could do the same thing in our broader criminal history database, and you would find a much more kind of a striking relationship, but the same pattern nonetheless. And the last thing I'll do is say, I'll just say this rather than go through the details. We also look to see whether this kind of pattern holds more generally. If I look at other contexts where hassle costs are higher, do we see troopers conducting searches less often? The context we're looking at here is, what county were you arrested in? For a bunch of reasons, some counties have much higher guilty or no contest rates than others. If I'm a trooper and I actually stop someone in a county where I'm much more likely to have to show up in court, am I less likely to search them in such a county? That would be consistent with the story that troopers are thinking about hassle costs when they're deciding whether to conduct a search. And that's exactly the pattern we identify here. So if I'm in a place where I'm more likely to have to show up in court, I'm less likely to conduct searches in that area. So let me conclude here. What we documented is descriptively these large class disparities in pretext stops and searches. Despite the fact that low-income motorists are much more likely to be searched, these searches are actually less productive than searches of high-income motorists. We showed evidence that at least in part, these disparities are driven by discrimination per se, and we present some suggestive evidence that this could be in part driven by disparities that are actually happening downstream in the court system and influencing policing behavior in that way. Okay, let me stop there. I realize I'm over time probably. Yeah. Thank you.